can also add some basic colors without making textures. So what you have in the list on the right are constants. So a constant 2, 3, and 4. You can also get this with the shortcuts 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the keyboard. So if you hold 1, just the number 1, you click, you will get constant 2, constant 3, constant 4. These are just colors or numbers, and numbers and colors are the same thing. That's an important understanding about the material editor, it is the same thing. If you look in Photoshop, at the end of the day, every pixel is nothing more but 3 numbers. Every color just represents 3 numbers. It's a mix of red, green, and blue. And just how much it's mixed gives you a certain color, but at the end of the day, it's just 3 numbers. Therefore, a number and a color is the same thing. Let's start with a constant 1. This is a normal constant, so constant 1. Let's connect that, or actually we can right click things as well and then do preview. Then it will only show the one you have selected. So now I'm previewing that. A constant 1 is basically a grayscale. 0 is black. If I select it and type 1 here at the bottom, it becomes white. If I type 0.5, it becomes 50% gray, etc. A constant 2 is red and green, so I can make red, I can make green, I can make yellow. See, now it's 100% red, 0% green, therefore it shows up as red. If both are 100%, it's yellow, and now it's green. So that's usually, this is not that useful, this one, because you can only get a certain amount of colors. Most useful one is the constant 3 vector, which is red, green, and blue. So you can create any color you want with this. So see, the mix of the numbers here gives you a different color. Now obviously, since it's just numbers, what you could technically do is, if you make this 0 and you multiply them together. So in the list, multiply that one, or hold the M key on the keyboard. M key on the keyboard and click somewhere in front of it, connect to, and then I'll preview this one. Then it's black. If you do 0 times something, it's still 0. If you do 0 times 100, it's still 0. So if you do 0 times purple, it's still black, 0. If you do 1 times purple, it's still the same, because 1 times 100 is still 100. If you do, however, 4 times purple, it becomes brighter. Because if you were to add these numbers together, it would lead to this color, or multiply the numbers together. Same goes for add. So you have some basic mathematical operations here, and add. You also have a subtract, and you have a divide. The add you can add with the A key on the keyboard. Same thing goes there. If I take, for example, 2 constants, I duplicate it with Ctrl W. If I take 2 constants and I make both of the constants 0.5, then this add represents 1, then this represents white. This is the same as having constant that says 1. See, there's no difference in that. 0.5 plus 0.5, 50% gray plus 50% gray becomes white, etc. So that's the basic idea with those colors. Now you can use that together with the textures you have to, for example, brighten it. Let's remove some of this. Let's actually remove all of it and just start over. I hold M for multiply. I add a constant. I connect that with the texture, and that goes to diffuse as it was. Now the texture is black. You can still see the specularity here, but the texture is actually black. If I make this 4, I brighten the texture. So now I can adjust brightness in here. And this doesn't really take any performance whatsoever to do this. It's a very, very tiny amount of performance that might go to this, I believe, but it's very, very small. So I usually tend to do things like this in here rather than in Photoshop. Of course, you can now take the texture, bring it into Photoshop and brighten it over there, but it's more effort. So usually on the fly, if I find out a texture is too dark, I just brighten it like this, a simple multiply. That also goes to Specular. What I see a lot of artists do in the beginning when they're not really accustomed to Unreal is they say, let's make a specular texture. They did, here's a specular texture, and then we'll just connect it to Speckle and we're done. No, you're not done. You're supposed to be able to scale this in Unreal. You're supposed to be able to do this same setup, multiply with a number, and then you connect that to Specular. Because the thing is, Unreal is a high dynamic range engine, meaning I just scaled this texture by 10. So I just made this one 10 times stronger. I made the white here, there's a white line here. I made that white line 10 times as bright. You would have never been able to do that in Photoshop, because this white line is already in Photoshop 100% white. If I take white here, the maximum of white you can get is this. There is nothing here. There is no white here that says 10 times this. No, there is only 100% white. So the only thing you can do is this in Photoshop. You can't paint this 10 times bright, but Unreal can, because it's high dynamic range. So if you're only going to input textures into Specularity or into anything else, and not do these kind of things, you just lose out on the whole high dynamic range part of the engine. And that's not very good. Now I can bring the specular texture up way beyond to what Photoshop would have been able to do. Plus it allows me to easily scale the specularity in here. So I can just decide, okay, well this looks quite kind of nice. Let's stick with that. And that's it. Also, to go through to the basic features here, there's a specular power underneath. If you add a constant to that, and the default is something like 32 or 40, 50 somewhere. This is basically the size of the hotspot, the size of the reflection. So if it's a very low number like 2, the specular is very wide. See, it basically covers a whole cube. If it's very big, if it's a very big number, it's a very concentrated hotspot. So you get a small reflection highlight. So this allows you to change the size of the specularity reflection like that. You can also, by the way, move the light in here. If you hold L, while holding L you move the mouse, you can move that light over the cube. In the same way that we can multiply it with a constant 1, we could have also multiplied it with a constant 3, and then it would have allowed us to change the color. So now we have a green wall. Of course there's still a specularity. Let me temporarily disconnect that so you can see it. So now I recolored the wall to be green or yellow, etc. So you can do some basic color modifications as well through this. Also there is something called a power, and that allows you to change the contrast. So if I do this, first the power, and the base is the texture that has to change. Exponent is the amount of contrast that then continues to multiply, and that multiply goes to constant 1. Now this is the brightness basically. In a way it's also a bit of contrast, but let's say it's the brightness, and this allows me to set the contrast. So now I have a more contrasted texture, as you can see. It gets more contrasted. And that's something that I often exploit. I often tend to then connect that to specular instead. Because if you were to make a basic specular texture of this in Photoshop, what would you do? You would probably just take this texture, maybe you would desaturate it a bit or so, or change the colors a little, but you would basically make it a lot more contrasted. Well, I just did that here as well. See, this is also a lot more contrasted. Therefore, I just did the same as you would have done with a specular texture in Photoshop. Therefore, I can just use that on specular. Like that. So diffuse is still the same, but now I use this setup. I use this setup for specular instead. And that also works, see, because now we also have a specular without even using any texture. This is something that I will really touch on in the second video, how to optimize your material, how to do things like these to reduce the number of textures you're using and reduce the memory load of your game. There's a lot of these kind of things. This is also what we'll do later on for the rock. We'll be making a little rock material. We'll do something similar to that. But just to give you a basic overview of the things you can do. So I made a basic specular texture by taking the diffuse in Unreal, making it more contrasted, and then making it brighter instead of using that texture. There's also basic animations you can add. You can add something called a penner. You can add something called a rotator. Let's start with that one. rotator, and there's something called also texture coordinate. That doesn't actually animate it, but it's still something that's very similar. And you can see they all three have this weird red to green gradient. If things have a weird gradient, it means they go on the right of a texture. So in general, usually the textures are, not always, but usually they are the furthest to the right, and then everything else happens in between the texture and this end block. Not so with these funny colors. If it has a funny color like this, it always goes on the right of a texture. So somewhere here. So if you had connected the panner here to the diffuse, to the UV, because this is basically going to distort the UV coordinates. And then if you set the speed here at the bottom, you can see it starts to move. So it's just the direction and how fast it goes. Likewise for a rotator, except it rotates obviously. You can set the speed and the center in the properties here. And the texture coordinate doesn't animate it, but it scales it. So here you can set U tiling, V tiling, so we can type like, now it's 4 times as tiled. Now obviously, because I have both a normal map here and a diffuse, and technically a specular, if you want to have this happen on everything, because right now the normal map is actually not tiled, you would have to connect the same one to all three. Like that. You can also choose to do things only on one part, because now I recolored the entire texture, I'm moving the whole texture, but let's say you only want to color part of a texture, or you only want to move part of a texture. Then we have to start using this one. So this texture, it's a good place to start with. It's basically a mask. We need some kind of image that identifies what parts of the texture should be modified and what parts should be left alone. So having a black and white mask allows us to say, okay, everything that's black, you're going to leave alone. But everything that's white, that has to become red, or that has to be animated. So this kind of texture, a black and white mask, will allow us to select only parts of the material, part of the texture, and only modify everything that's white or black. The way we do that is by using something called a linear interpolate, or otherwise called a lerp, as you can read here. You can also get this if you hold L key on the keyboard. A lerp, very fancy name, it basically just blends two textures together through a third texture. It basically alpha blends things together. It will blend A with B based on the alpha. And the alpha is this. So let's make a bit more space here. You can have the selection frame that I'm using, holding Ctrl, Alt and dragging. So you can move things like that. Okay, so this texture is the alpha. You can probably use the RGB. The black box is red, green and blue combined. But you can also choose to use just the red channel or just the green channel, just the blue channel. So actually I'm just going to use red, because on a black and white image, red, green and blue are all the same anyway. A is a texture as it was. And B is the texture multiplied with a color. So B is the same texture but very bright and very red. Preview that quickly and that works. See, so now only the parts that are white in the alpha, only those parts use B, everything else uses A. So everything that's black here shows a texture as it originally was, everything that's white shows a texture multiplied with a lot of red. Change that to another color, now it's going to be yellow, etc. And then this would have normally connected to diffuse. In the same way, you could have also done that for animation. So I duplicated the lerp. To keep it clean, I'll just duplicate this. Could have connected it from the other one, just trying to keep the layout a bit clean. In the same way, you could have done it with the animation. You could have had the texture twice. So A is a texture as it is, like it is over there. But B, however, is that texture with a panner next to it. And that then goes to A, it just replaces the original one over there. And I'll set a speed there. I think you can't really see it because of the specularity. Or it's still not very obvious. Let's see what happens. Here we can see it. It's just the multiply on top. Actually, the multiply uses the same one. That's why you can't see this. So the multiply should have been using the lerp as well. There we go. So see, now we can move it. The specular is still same place. So that's why you see this scratch isn't moving, but everything else there is now moving. So now you're moving only part of it. You can also freeze things using a panner or a rotator. It's the same thing. So let's say you actually want to offset a texture. You don't want to have it move all the time. You simply want to offset it. Well, what you can do then, and layout gets a bit confusing here perhaps, but what you could do then, I'll start over here in a totally empty space, is if you normally take a texture, you connect a panner to it, it will do this, right? But if you then connect a constant to time, it will allow you to freeze it in time. So now this number represents where it's frozen. If I type 0.5 here, the texture will be 50% offsetted. Now I can manually type where it should be positioned. So I can manually offset textures with this as well. And a rotator would have done exactly the same. Except you can, you're freezing the rotation. And from here on, we can then start moving on to setting up a couple of our materials. So we have 3 materials to set up. We have the road, we have the plant, the little dry shrub there, and we have the entire landscape. And we also have the rock. So we have a couple of basic materials to set up. So I'm first going to set up all those materials in a very basic way, and then we're going to go back to each material and set up specific properties of each of those. And because of that, we can then do some more quite advanced things actually, with using world position to planar map textures in Unreal, and to change the color of things, to make things react to the wind, etc. So these were the basics. Now we can move forward to more advanced things. Also, every time you want to see your material in the viewport, you should right away press that green V here, the checkbox thing. That will actually apply and compile everything you did here. So none of this is saved until you press OK. If you close the window, like if you change something, then close the window, it also will ask you, do you want to save and compile it, Yes. So I'm making a couple of new materials here for each of my, the rock, the road, the landscape, and the shrub. So instead of right-clicking somewhere and doing new material, you can also make it slightly easier on yourself and doing right-clicking a texture and then pick create new material. Then I will select my package from the list here, group materials. I remove the D here because it's not really needed anymore. And OK on that. I'll quickly do that for all of them. We have 4 empty materials here. I'll quickly open them up. See, this automatically placed the texture in here. Makes it slightly easier and slightly faster to work with. So I can simply connect that. OK. Next one, let's take the rock. One special thing actually about a rock is, first of all, we need to bring in the normal map as well. And as you can see, there's no specular. I only have a diffuse and a normal map for it. That's because, like I said earlier, I usually generate specularity in Unreal to save space, which I've also done here. And instead of using a power, as I've just done, I can also, slightly less, gives you less control, but it's just easier. I use two multiplies. The first multiplies just multiplies the texture, the diffuse, with itself, which results in a darker and more contrasted texture, because if you multiply something with itself, it gets more contrasted. If you multiply a bright pixel, which is say 0.9, 90% white, if you do 0.9 times 0.9, you will get 0.81. However, if you then also, if you multiply the pixel that's next to it, which is say 0.1, 10% bright, so nearly black, 0.1 times 0.1 is 0.01. So now the first pixel is 0.81 still, and the next pixel is 0.01. So the difference between the two got bigger, therefore you got more contrast. So this is a very simple way of getting more contrast. And then I multiply that with a constant just to get a bit more brightness in, and use that as specularity. You could of course argue a rock doesn't really need much specularity, but I just added it as so you understand how the system works. That's that. Okay. Quickly do the soil as well. I have one texture in here that's connecting that to diffuse, and I'm going to add a texture coordinate behind this one so I can set the scaling, because I think it should probably be smaller, like that. And then the shrub. The shrub is, however, a special case because it is transparent, and that will bring us to a new topic here. So just doing this obviously doesn't help anymore, because this doesn't work. It should be transparent. You should be able to only see the branches. This has an alpha channel in it. There's actually the white one here contains the alpha. If I double click the texture, you can see it's masked out because it contains an alpha. Most textures don't contain an alpha, and having an alpha in a texture actually makes it a lot slower. This is again something that we'll get back to in the second video, but an alpha is usually a bad idea. Not the most brilliant idea in this texture either, but since it's only a 256 by 256 texture, it's doable, and also to keep the example simple. So we can take the alpha and connect the alpha to opacity or opacity mask. I'll temporarily connect it to both just for showing what will happen. Also, you can see it's grayed out. It's grayed out because the material is not configured to use these things. So the first thing you have to do, besides connecting it to opacity or opacity mask, is tell the material to start looking for this. If you click in empty space somewhere here, and then look at the bottom, you'll get the properties of the entire material. There's a section called material, and there it says blend mode opaque. If we change that to translucent, it looks like it should be looking, as you can see. Translucent uses opacity. We could have also used masked, and that uses opacity mask. So that's the difference. Translucent uses opacity, and masked uses opacity mask. The difference between the two is that masking is 1-bit alpha. It's on or off. Either something is visible, like the branch here, or it's not visible, like the background. Translucent, however, allows for full transparency. Something could be 20% visible, or it could be 40% visible, etc. So you get nice, smooth. Yeah, it's going to be very hard to see, but it nicely fades in. That, however, is also a lot slower to render again, because if you do it full transparency, it's a lot more difficult for the engine to figure out what object is in front of what object. That's the sorting. It has to sort the pixels. It has to figure out this plant is in front of the other plant. However, I can still see 20% of the other plant, and I can still see 4% of the plant behind that, etc. So it has to figure out a lot of these different layers, a lot of these different plants in the distance. And that will make it really slow. So for that reason, and also because you will get issues where it can't figure out anymore what's in front of what, so you will start getting sorting problems. So for those reasons, things like plants should always be masked and never translucent, even if it's a little bit more ugly. See, this is a bit harsher, and it's not so nice, but this is a lot faster to render. Because now the engine doesn't really have a problem. It just can simply say, okay, this is there, this is 100% opaque, and this is not. That's it. So I can disconnect opacity here as it's not used anymore. And here is our basic plant material. Also, there is a box here two-sided. I'm going to enable that because that will allow the plant to be seen from both sides. See, this is a cube. I can now see the face of the other side of the cube. I can leave that be for a moment. And then we should assign this. I will save it as well. Then we should assign that to the meshes. So I'll open up each mesh. I'll go to lot info 0, elements 0, etc. And here it says material. This is the default material used by the mesh. So I'll make sure every material I made is assigned to each of those properties. So I select plant here. If I press the green arrow on something, it will take over the current selection in the content browser. So by doing this, it automatically takes that because that's selected. There we go. So now we can see the plant. Likewise for the other ones. I'll take the landscape and I'll put soil on it. And there we go. All the objects are textured. I can quickly again save it and I'll quickly add it to my scene here. You can see the ground is much too small to begin with already. And I didn't position this correctly, it seems. I'll quickly add in my rock. So we have that in the level as well. Scale it up a bit. Yeah, here we also have a bug, by the way. You might experience this as well. I'm capturing this on 1280 and Unreal isn't really made for the resolution. So what happens now is that the label, as you can see here, the label of the mesh extends over these boxes. Therefore, I can no longer actually type 4. When that happens, and you really want to type a different number there, you can also change these boxes through the properties. I'm going to do that instead. It says display here, and here it says draw scale 3D and draw scale. These 4 numbers are the same as these 4 numbers. As you can see, I never use a scaling tool and never use that because it gets very weird random numbers, which I don't like. I don't like numbers like yeah, it doesn't always update there. Still didn't update. I don't like numbers like these. It's very hard to work with, especially for modular meshes. So I tend to type in all the sizes manually. I have a couple of rocks. That's it. It's good enough. Also, I can see my player start is actually floating above the ground. What you can do to position an actor on the ground instantly is press End on the key, so the End key. However, since my ground has no collision, it doesn't want to do that. You press End on an actor, it will immediately snap it to the ground, and this is the correct height. It shouldn't actually be on the ground. Also, what I tend to do is press W to quickly hide all meshes so I can click in nowhere. When I have something selected, I don't want anything selected anymore. I just tend to do this, hide all meshes, click in nowhere, display all meshes.